Hey, what's up, everybody? Just wanted to do something different today. Gonna talk about a guy named Brian Jones. Today would have been his 75th birthday if he hadn't died. Um, he's a member of the band The Rolling Stones. Everyone's heard of the Rolling Stones. So, and who do you think of when you think of the Rolling Stones? You think of Mick Jagger and you think of Keith Richards. But what if I told you that they didn't even form the band? They didn't even name the band. They had nothing to do with the formation of this band. I mean, they were in it, but they were formed. It was formed by a guy named Brian Jones, who was a multi-instrumentalist and just an all-around musical genius. Played a lot of instruments, like I said, but his downfall was he wasn't a very good songwriter. Now, I'll get more into that as I go on, but he's been kind of forgotten by history. I mean, people know of him. People who are really into the Rolling Stones and into music of the 60s and stuff like that know who he is. But for the most part, you don't hear anything about him. So I just want to do a video to tell you about him because he's really important, really talented, and it's a shame that people don't know who he is. So I wrote down some stuff. I was considering just talking about his musical contributions, but he had a very interesting life before that, so I figured I'd talk about that a little bit too. So he was born February 28th, 1942. He had two sisters. Yeah, were the names Barbara and Pamela. And Pamela died of leukemia at age 2, which is really fucking sad. He was very sickly as a child. He had a bout of the croup. I don't know how prevalent that is anymore, but he had that when he was a baby, which resulted in him having asthma for his whole life. And believe me, I can tell you all about asthma. I know it sucks. He had a very musical upbringing. His mother, Louisa, was a piano teacher, and his father, Louis, played organ, and he led the choir at the local church. So music was a big part of his life from the beginning. He became interested in jazz at a really young age. His parents purchased him a saxophone. Then a couple years after that, they got him an acoustic guitar, his first guitar, and it would prove to be a very important moment in his life. He was really gifted. He was a smart guy, and it showed in school. But he had problems. He had problems with authority. He had problems with conforming. And while he got excellent grades at school, and he was like genius level as far as grades go, he got into a lot of trouble and was suspended many times. And eventually he left school. He got someone pregnant when he was 17. Let me see if I can find the name of the baby. Simon. Got a girl pregnant when he was 17. She had his baby named Simon, and he was put up for adoption. And because of that, it was, if he was 17, it was like 1959. So at that time, getting a girl pregnant when you're 17 was very frowned upon. And because of all of that, he left home, left school at that time, traveled through Europe playing guitar on the streets for money, but eventually he ran out of money. He had to go home to England. He began playing at jazz and blues clubs. He listened to classical music a lot when he was a child, but what he was really got him going was the blues. And he was obsessed with the blues. People like Muddy Waters, Johnny Lee Hooker. I know a lot of their names, but I can't think of them right now. Basically, everyone who was a blues musician back then. A lot of the English musicians at the time were buying blues records from America, blues records that people in America were overlooking. The kids in England were buying and forming bands and taking over the world, basically. So, yeah, he played a lot at jazz and blues clubs. He decided to form a band in 1962. Before that, he was in a band called the Roosters. Oh, I forgot to mention, he had a second child in 1959 from a one-night stand with a married woman. The child was named Belinda, and her and her husband decided to raise the child, and Brian Jones actually never knew about the child, so he had a second child the same year as the first one and knew nothing about it. So he got around, apparently. But, yeah, he decided, he was in a band called the Roosters in the early 60s. He left that band and was replaced by a guitar player you might have heard of named Eric Clapton. So he quit that band, decided to form another band, put out ads saying he wanted to join a blues band. He wanted to form a blues band, and he got Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, you might have heard of them, Ian Stewart, and Dick Taylor, who ended up going on to a band called the Pretty Things, who are another really good band. So they formed this band, blues-based, strictly blues. Brian Jones' band. They didn't have a name. He was on the phone with a promoter, and they asked him, well, what's your band's name? And there was a Muddy Waters record on the floor. And the first track on side 2 he saw was Rolling Stone. So he added a G at the end of Rolling. And history was made. The Rolling Stones were formed. And that was that. So, yeah. And just before that, he had another kid named Julian. And he actually stepped up for this one, sold his record collection to pay for baby clothes and stuff. And then, in July of 64, he had another kid named Julian. And then in October of 64, he had another kid named Paul. And the mother of this kid was paid off to not say anything. So at this time, the Stones were getting very big. Paid off by the Rolling Stones management to not say anything. And so, yeah, he had a fifth kid. I guess they didn't want him being a father to tarnish their image, which they don't really understand because they had a real bad boy image at the time anyway. But whatever. So he had 5 kids by the time he was like 22, which is totally insane. But, so that happened. So he forms this band called the Rolling Stones with Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Ian Stewart, and Dick Taylor. I told you how they got the name. He taught Mick Jagger how to play harmonica. He's really into the blues. He wanted this to be a blues band and nothing more. Kind of like Eric Clapton used to be with the Yardbirds. And eventually, some people left. He got Bill Wyman to join to play bass and Charlie Watts to play drums, and that became the classic Rolling Stones lineup. And Brian Jones was the unquestioned leader of the band at this point. Now this went on for a little while. They'd play clubs, playing blues, strictly blues music. They were noticed by a guy named Andrew Luke Oldham, who they hired to become their manager, and this is when things started going downhill for Brian Jones. Andrew Luke Oldham stressed the importance to the band of writing their own songs, which is understandable considering bands like the Beatles, who wrote they did some covers too, but a majority of their songs were written by them. And there's a famous story of Andrew Luke Oldham locking Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in a room together until they wrote a song, and they came out with the song Tell Me, which is the only original composition on the Rolling Stones' first album. But this is when Brian Jones started being overshadowed in the band. He was insanely talented musician, played many instruments, but could not write a good song to save his life. And that's when he started getting overshadowed by Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, who were started cranking out some great songs and kind of taking the band in another direction that Brian wasn't happy about. He was strictly about the blues, and they're taking it as in a more pop direction as Brian Jones saw it to be. This led to some depression, and which led to drug and alcohol abuse, which led to changes in his personality. He became unfriendly and antisocial, and he was just having a bad time. He had lost control of his band. He had lost control of the direction of his band that he formed and named, and he was self-destructing. He was arrested for drug possession in May of '67. Around the same time, his girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg, who's a whole other story, he left him for Keith Richards, his bandmate, while he was in the hospital at the time. So that made the relationship between him and Keith Richards even more stressed than it was already. He became bored with the whole being a Rolling Stone thing. He didn't like the direction they were going. He stopped showing up to sessions, so there'd be sessions without him, which is a big deal when he's obviously the most musically talented out of anyone in the band. He kind of became an absentee member of the band. His life became drugs. He was depressed. He felt like he was being overlooked. He felt like he wasn't an important part of the band anymore. And he had formed the band, and it's sad. And he just lost himself in drugs. His last real sessions with the band were when they're recording the Jumping Jack Flash single and the Beggars Banquet album. Both are amazing. And his last appearance with the Stones was in December of 1968 on a special the Stones recorded called The Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. Now, I talked about this a little bit in my review of A Quick One by The Who. There was a special the Rolling Stones did, which was meant to air on national TV, but wasn't, and didn't end up getting released at all till the 90s. And mostly because the Stones were unhappy with their live performance. It was a pretty good performance. I've seen it. But they were outdone by The Who. They knew they were outdone by The Who. And a big part of that was because Brian Jones was just totally out of it. He looked gone. He looked almost dead in that. And Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend of The Who had commented after that they thought this was probably going to be Brian Jones' last performance with the Stones, and it ended up being that. The Stones had a new album out, and they wanted to tour in 1969, but Brian Jones was not in any shape to tour. Mentally, physically, he was incapable of making music at this time. His mouth actually bled when he played harmonica. It's just so sad. He couldn't receive a work permit because of all the drug convictions. There was a few more I hadn't mentioned, but he was convicted a few more times. And finally, in June of 1969, he was visited by Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts, and told, basically, you're out of the band. We're going to continue on without you. And he was replaced by a guy named Mick Taylor. And so basically, this band that he had formed, that he had named, that he was responsible for the early musical direction of, he was now kicked out of, and made his depression and his drug abuse a lot worse. And finally, on the night of July 2nd going into July 3rd of 1969, he was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool, um, due to what is assumed to be drug overdose. The coroner said that his heart and his liver were very enlarged by drug and alcohol abuse. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about his death. There's some people that think he was murdered. There's books out there you can find about it. You can look online about it. I'm not really going to talk about it here because there's nothing proven. I'm not saying it is suspicious. There's some suspicious circumstances surrounding his death, for sure. But, I mean, the guy was almost dead anyway. He was a major drug addict. He didn't want to live anymore. He didn't want anything. He died. He did too many drugs. He died at the bottom of this pool. Whether it was the drugs or someone did something to him, I mean, it matters, but he wasn't going to live long after that anyway. It's a really sad story. It's tragic. He was an amazing musician in one of the biggest bands in the history of rock and roll, and one of the most popular bands in the history of rock and roll, and everybody knows who they are, but most people don't know who Brian Jones is. So I just wanted to shed a little light on who he was on today, which is his birthday. His 75th would have been. And who knows what he would have been doing today if he had survived. Maybe they would have reconciled at some point. Maybe he would have got off the drugs. I don't think he would have, though. He was way too far gone. And Mick Jagger and Keith Richards weren't helping matters. They talked about it later on and said that they acted like children. They picked on them. They were young and they were rich, and they didn't care about a whole lot else. And looking back on it now, they feel bad, but Brian Jones wasn't exactly someone who was easy to deal with. His personality issues, his drug issues, which contributed to that. Just a sad story all around. But on a happy note, the music he made with the Rolling Stones is still around everywhere. You hear it every day on the radio. It's everywhere. So I just wanted to, if you ever wanted to look up some of these songs and listen to some of the brilliance of Brian Jones and some of the instruments he played on these songs, I highly recommend doing it. Okay, now there's Little Red Rooster. He plays the slide guitar on that song. And I'm a King Bee. Little Red Rooster and I'm a King Bee are probably my favorites as far as his slide guitar. Now he plays the sitar on songs like Painted Black, which I'm sure everybody's heard. One of the biggest songs they ever did. Great song. Street Fighting Man, he also plays the sitar on. Love that song. Let's Spend the Night Together. It's a pretty popular one. He plays the organ on that. Under My Thumb, he plays the marimba. Ruby Tuesday, he plays the recorder. You know that instrument we had to play in school? He actually made it cool. Child of the Moon, he played the saxophone. Citadel, he played the saxophone. I Am Waiting and Lady Jane, he played the Appalachian dulcimer. She's a Rainbow at 2,000 Light Years from Home. Oh, and We Love You, he plays the mellotron on. I'm a huge fan of the mellotron. I love his work with the mellotron. It's amazing. And songs like Ride On Baby and You Got the Silver, he played the auto harp on. Now there's other ones too. Those are just some of them. But he contributed a lot to the Stones' early direction. And even when the band was going in a direction he wasn't happy with, like the mid to late 60s, he was a decent sport and contributed his share with the instruments he knew how to play and made the songs that much more great with his presence. And my personal opinion, I love the Rolling Stones. I grew up Beatles, Rolling Stones. There was a time when I was a young child that I wasn't aware there were other bands besides the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But as great. The Stones came out with great stuff after Brian Jones died. But to me, they lost their creativity after Brian Jones died. They just became a rock band, which there's nothing wrong with that. They became one of the best rock bands there ever was. But before that, I feel like they were more than that before Brian Jones died. Of course, they were trying to keep up with bands like the Beatles during the 60s. But, I don't know. I like their 60s stuff the most, personally. I like the diversity in their music. I mean, they have an album that's basically their version of Sgt. Pepper. Very underrated album. And they decided after Brian Jones died that they were going to be a rock and roll band, and that's all they were going to be, which is totally fine. But I don't know. I can't help but look back on those early records and wonder what could have been if Brian Jones had survived. Not that I'm putting down. I mean, albums like Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street are some of the greatest records ever recorded. But you gotta wonder what direction they might have gone in had he not self-destructed the way he did. So, yeah, that's my little video about Brian Jones. Maybe some people will watch it. Maybe some people will be interested and go listen to some of these songs I mentioned. And celebrate the life of Brian Jones, because somebody needs to. You hear the Stones on the radio every day. You don't. No one ever mentions Brian Jones. So, I wanted to mention him. I wanted to tell you about him. That's my contribution. So, have a great day, everybody. And listen to the Stones, because they're fucking great. Have a great day.